And you're the incoming chairman of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. Congratulations on that, and do you have any goals for your tenure?
I do have some goals, yes. I've got a plan which I had to submit as part of my proposal to become chairman. And there are three strands to that. So the first is to really continue the trajectory. You know, the success of the council over the last 10 years has been quite immense, but there's still a lot of opportunity to improve representation around the world. At the same time, strengthen the brand, so to make sure that the council is more famous for all the great things that we do. And thirdly, to create an organisation that supports that, which is robust in its controls and in the people back in Chicago and other places around the world, really just to future-proof the organisation, I guess.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the economics of tall building design and
Subject
development.
close to my heart, yes.
Indeed. So you worked on the Shard, or were involved with the project team there.
Yep.
That was one of the most expensive skyscrapers ever built.
No.
No? That's my understanding it was.
No, and here is the crux of the subject. So this is something that I always like to start with economics. It's not purely about height. There are things which are just as, if not more important than mere height. So the Shard, which still is the tallest building in Western Europe, so everyone says to me that exact thing, therefore must be the most expensive. Pounds per square foot or pounds per square metre, whichever metric you prefer, it isn't the most expensive, and that's because shape is more important, and shape has a number of strands to it, the size of the floor plate, the geometry of the building. It had a lot of things going for it. So the profile of the building with the reducing size of floor plates perfectly matched the different uses, from office to hotel to residential at the top. A very strong central core, which then enabled a fairly efficient and straightforward structural frame. Some pretty tight floor-to-floor dimensions. Therefore, it's not at the top of the benchmark range.
When you go by a per square foot or per unit area basis, then it's not.
No.
Okay, understood. How do you separate out from a project development team, say, that initial just price tag of the total amount versus, as you say, this longer term price per square foot measures? Because you got to get all the capital for the huge sum of money, even if it is per square foot, a relatively good deal.
Yes.
You have to get that capital up front.
You do, and that is one of the most difficult things from a developer's perspective in terms of the cash flow. And being able to, I mean, they've got to commit. You know, the tall buildings are like very large engineering projects. They're large tankers with irreversible financial commitments at the outset. Therefore, you need deep pockets. No matter how efficient from a cost or floor area perspective the building is, you still need a lot of money up front before that income rolls in. Therefore, it's not for the faint-hearted and not for people that don't have a lot of funding and cash behind them.
Yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted, but it's also got a risk for anybody. So how do you best mitigate that risk? Is it by getting money from a lot of different sources?
Yeah, increasingly you have a consortium of investors. So 22 Bishopsgate in London is a really good example of this, which is going to be over 2 million square feet of office buildings, so, and well over £500 million worth as a construction project alone. And that's a consortium of investors which is fronted by AXA, who are French-based, some Canadian property funds, Temasek from Singapore, and others as well. So that's how they spread the risk and also make the investment more manageable.
To be financially viable, does a super tall building have to be built quickly?
Speed is important. So there are three elements to make it viable. One is speed, one is cost, and one is area efficiency. And they're all equally important. But it's not something you can rush. You need to get it right, and you don't want to hit problems by starting off with an unrealistic program or schedule. But yes, squeezing each of those 3 points in the triangle is important. You need to consider it right at the outset.
Given the huge upfront investment that we've been talking about, what sort of rate of return does a super tall building project have? Can you say generally if this is something that pays off in a roughly in a certain amount of time?
It's difficult to generalize, but it's a classic risk and reward. The risks are greater, but the rewards are potentially greater as well. The only thing is that those rewards take a bit longer to come in. Therefore, the investors need to take a longer term view and be able to do that.
How long of a time period are you talking about?
It could, well, Shard's a great example. First few years, it didn't let very quickly, but then the investors knew that and anticipated that. So, that is now 5 years on from completion, and it's now, turning a good profit. And fully let offices, a hotel which is running successfully, and a set of high-value apartments at the top, which they've chosen not to sell or let and keep themselves at the moment. So, overall, a tall building, if it's very tall and complex, can take 15 years from inception to actually turn a profit.
Right, and yet we're seeing more and more of them every year.
Yeah.
And why is that? More people are amenable to the risk, or has the economics changed, or?
Well, I don't think the economics, the basic equation will never change. Value less cost equals profit. I don't think we're necessarily seeing a greater proportion of iconic and expensive towers, because as they increase, then so does the more numerous, shall we say, more functional and sensible buildings have to. And there's the challenge. Building tall residential for the masses, just as important as building icons for a city.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, how do you keep the city affordable when you have so much attention and capital and excitement, planning, resources going towards large iconic structures and things like that?
Because tall buildings are only one part of the answer. They're not appropriate for every location in every city. It requires a mix of real estate, and tall buildings will be a particular answer for part of the city, but not for all of it.
What are some interesting trends in tall building design and development that you find exciting?
I think what's really exciting is technology. I've always said that at some point there'll be a major step change in the way buildings are designed, built, and occupied, and we're not there yet. If you go back and look at the history of construction and major innovations in tall buildings, there aren't that many. It started off with the elevator and steel frames, and then air conditioning units, and then to a certain extent the power of computing. But we're still waiting for that next thing. And will it be, some advances in material technology, or some other smart technologies come to the fore? I'm convinced there'll be something which is pretty major.
Something that'll fundamentally change design and development of tall buildings.
I think so.
Care to speculate at all what that might be?
Personally, I wouldn't mind. I think the most important impact will come from material technology. Stronger, lighter materials, which eventually will be cheaper to produce.
I guess you're already seeing that a little bit with the rise of super slims. These very thin, very tall, high-value buildings were not physically possible previously.
High value, but not low cost.
Sure.
So they can only exist because of the value. So if you take the pencil-thin towers in New York, for example,
right,
where people, high net worth individuals, are willing to pay $10,000 a square foot for a great view of Central Park, but that sustains a high construction cost.
Do you think that's a positive trend or a negative one?
I don't think it's negative. You can only have so many of those types of buildings, and there are only so many extremely rich people in the world who can afford to buy them. I think and this is something we're seeing across the world in various locations, the key challenge is whether they'll be lived in. So, rich investors from afar using them to park their money, but are they going to live there?
Yeah. We've seen a lot of tall building development all over the world. By and large, the economy's been going up overall since the recession. Are you worried that there's going to be another recession and that'll damage the global real estate boom we've been seeing and change the whole picture of this kind of up and more tall buildings everywhere trend that we've been seeing?
Look, I'm a cost consultant. I always worry. I worry about costs. I worry about recessions. Economics and property industry is cyclical, so there will be recession at some point, and different parts of the world it might come at different times. Although what I would say is the world is obviously a much more connected place, right, economically as well than it has been. Therefore, If one country catches a cold on one side of the world, then it tends to mean that other countries do on the other side, and I'm seeing that a lot more. But what I'm also seeing are investors who are actually looking globally and more longer term, who, for example, are seeing worries in the UK because of Brexit, but are actually not too worried about it because they think it's a blip and they can look 5 or 10 years ahead.
Do you take any lessons from the Grenfell disaster about fire safety, about public housing, about anything? And what responsibility do you think members of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat have to take lessons from that disaster and make sure that something like that doesn't happen again?
There are going to be some massive lessons from that disaster. I wouldn't like to speculate what they are at the moment. I mean, there's due process. There's a very important public inquiry which has commenced in the UK. There's a criminal investigation as well. So people need to be careful about what they speculate. But I'm absolutely certain that building regulations will change in the UK. I've already seen from conversations I've had yesterday here in Australia that that's already prompted changes to codes and the way buildings are beginning to be conceived here, and it'll have an impact across the whole tall building community across the globe, quite rightly. And it's a good reminder, actually. Grenfell is not the only instance where this has happened in the past 5 years. It's happened in the Middle East. It's happened in Australia. I'm pretty convinced not only will building regs change, I think the way that construction is managed will change. And I think all of that will have an impact on design and cost, quite rightly too.
Do you worry that tall buildings, especially super tall buildings and mega tall and all the attention that they get, either feeds or is a symptom of global inequality?
I think that's a really interesting point. And if you look at, I think increasingly there's a great connection between politics and economics. And if you look at what's happening in the world and this potential move towards more populist movements, anti-trade rhetoric from Trump and others, and some disillusionment across the world, I think part of that is due to this sort of increasing divide between the very wealthy and the very poor. And sometimes people perceive tall buildings as being, a sort of an enactment of capitalism, and we need to be careful about that.
How so? I mean, what can you do as a developer, for example?
Well, I think going back to something I said earlier, it's not just icons and landmark towers have a place, and in many ways they are sort of a symbol of prosperity, and they have their place in cities in terms of signifying their skylines. I think more focus has to be placed on the other buildings, the 95% of the stock which actually help the real estate and help people find a home.